Hello again. My first novel of 2023 was a book that I'd heard good things about quite a few times before, and that was a very well-received book when it came out just around 10 years ago. Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is the story of a Nigerian woman who moves to the United States for college, sticks around there for a while, and eventually returns to Nigeria as an Americanah, which seems to be the word Nigerians use for people in this exact situation, because they often return having been culturally transformed and they act differently, speak differently, and think differently, as you would of course expect of just about anyone who lives in another country for a long period, especially when they're young, but probably at any time of life, really. The author, Adichie, is a Nigerian who, like her main character, Ifemelu, also lived in America for some time, studying at a university here, and I believe still does live in America some of the time. Much like characters in other novels who bear at least some superficial resemblance to the author, I'm thinking in particular of Celine in Elif Batuman's The Idiot and subsequently Either Or. It might occasionally be difficult to ascertain the boundary between the fiction and fact of Adichie's main character, but I think it's probably fair to assume, based on the way Ifemelu is portrayed, that she shares some of the author's experiences, but is by no means specifically supposed to represent Adichie. So in that way, the resemblance is probably less than what's intended in Elif Batuman's works, which were explicitly written with more of an autobiographical touch. The novel feels to me authentically Nigerian, which is, of course, is funny for me to say because I have almost no idea what that means. But I know from reading some interviews and reviews that this was the author's intention, and I got the sense while reading it that although it's perfectly readable for non-Nigerians, particularly in the parts about the characters' lives in America or for smaller sections of the UK, there are certain aspects of it that will resonate the most with someone who has lived in Nigeria or has some Nigerian heritage, parts that I didn't quite get on the same depth that others would. And I like that this novel is unapologetically Nigerian in that way without needing to explain itself. For example, the earlier part of the book references recent Nigerian history and politics around the turn of the 21st century or a little bit before, references that will go over the heads of most American readers, including, I admit, myself, but Adichie doesn't feel the need to hold the reader's hands to explain the relevance of every single one of these events. Instead, she simply shows how these events interact with her characters' lives. If you know, you know, and if you don't, well, it doesn't really make the story any harder to follow, but if you want to learn more, you can then go and look up some of the details on your own time, which I did, in fact. Fun fact, by the way, in case you didn't know, Nigeria is the 6th most populous country in the world and the most populous in Africa. I knew that Lagos was a big city, but I didn't realize just how many people live in Nigeria until very recently. For my fellow Americans out there, at the time I'm filming this in 2023, the Nigerian population is estimated at just under 2/3 of the US total population. Or also, based on some quick calculations, 1 out of every 37 humans alive today lives in Nigeria. I'll say right now that if you consider this a spoilable book, then I'm probably going to spoil it. I don't think it's all that spoilable. There is one point that at least some readers will be curious about, although I'd say my curiosity about that point was pretty mild overall in comparison with my interest in other aspects of the book, and I'll give you a heads up much later in the review towards the end before I let that out of the bag. I think it's a book, though, where if you're going to enjoy it, then knowing the high-level plot and resolution isn't going to ruin that at all. There's a lot to be found in this book, sometimes in a good way and other times in a way that becomes a little too much. Personally, I really liked the first third or so of the book, which centers mostly on Ifemelu's life in Nigeria before she came to the United States, and subsequently on her early years in the US as she began to culturally adjust to her new life there. The story isn't told entirely in chronological order, since much of it is a sort of extended reflection by Ifemelu as she gets her hair done in a New Jersey hair salon focused on African hair and contemplates her imminent return to Nigeria, because apparently this process of getting her hair done is a pretty long process. I think they said 6 hours it was going to take at some point. And in this first third of the book, I was flabbergasted by just how many rich experiences were relayed, wondering how there could be 3 times this much material covered in the book and how it could possibly all come together. Which it turns out there isn't really 3 times that much material in this book, and it doesn't all come together. Not that it needed to come together tidily or ever appeared that it really would. I think that actually would have been a disappointment if it did, given the sort of novel that this is. But the tightness of the narrative definitely suffers more in the middle of the book. Making middle to late chapters start to feel like a slog, and I found myself just waiting for things to wrap up. And from reading reviews, I'm not the only person who thought this way, even for many people who, like me, enjoyed the book in many ways. Part of this could be just that as someone who lives in the United States, I found it inherently more interesting and curious to read about Ifemelu's life in Nigeria, where I've never been and know quite little about, almost nothing. But that's not really all, because I actually quite enjoyed learning about Ifemelu's early years in the United States as she navigated the challenges of a country that had its attractions, but also didn't fulfill her expectations of it in every way. In many ways, she had a very rough time, struggling to afford the basic necessities of life for a while. And amidst these struggles, which are some of the most serious, darkest parts of the book, we honestly also see some of the funniest parts of the book. I'll say a bit more on it later, but a lot of the caricatures the narrator draws of the people she meets are funny and clever, while showing enough restraint to prevent them from becoming dehumanizing or to feel too mean. And this was true to some extent in Nigeria too, but I think this aspect of the narrative really comes into its element once she reaches the United States. For example, one character I really enjoyed was a white woman named Kimberly, whose children Ifemelu babysits for a while in the beginning to middle of the book. She's portrayed as a good-hearted woman, and I mean that in a sincere way, but she treats the topic of race in a way that feels a little funny to the reader in this satirical way, not intentionally offensive, but occasionally a little uncomfortable, but very real and understandable for someone of her background. That is to say, she mostly tiptoes around the topic of race, treating it as a sort of taboo subject. Like Ifemelu says, Kimberly will be talking about a friend from a certain organization she's in. Kimberly's involved with some charity work, and she'll say, "Oh, Ifemelu, you really love this woman. She's just the most beautiful woman." And after hearing similar descriptions a lot of times and meeting these people, Ifemelu realizes that beautiful is a word that Kimberly habitually uses to describe women who are black, but in Ifemelu's eyes are not particularly beautiful. They're just regular looking women. And at one point, Ifemelu finally feels comfortable enough to point this out to Kimberly, whom she really does respect, but she just finds it a little odd or unusual, this language. And Kimberly kind of laughs in understanding that they've kind of broken this barrier. And Ifemelu says that this is the point when Kimberly and she really became friends. So with all this, why did I find the story to drag in the second half? Well, it's around this point that the narrator begins a relationship with an African-American professor named Blaine. Now, Blaine seems like a cool guy in the end, and he's a well-crafted character. He's believable as a person, but he's unfortunately not good for the overall narrative, at least as he's used here, in my opinion. Actually, I'm not even sure that Blaine himself is the problem. I think he just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, because he's a good milestone for this point in the book in which many different things happen that slow everything down. While the earlier versions of Ifemelu liked to hang out with friends in her Auntie Uju and talk about her feelings and aspirations, or were expressive of her struggles and sometimes despair upon arriving in America, or they highlighted in an active way the conflicts and contradictions in adopting an American lifestyle as a Nigerian immigrant. And they did so in a way that I found really captivating. By contrast, once we reach this point when Blaine enters the story, which also happens to be when Ifemelu is getting further along in her college and eventually graduate school career, we no longer really learn about Ifemelu's experience through her activities in life, but instead by listening in on a bunch of academic, stuffy-feeling conversations about culture, politics, and race in the United States. And okay, as much of a bummer as it sounds for me to say this, maybe it's because that literally is Ifemelu's life as a grad student. She's in a relationship with a professor, not a professor who she's working for. And all of her friends are sort of various caricatures of a liberal college crowd, having a lot of bland observations to make about American society. Not that there's no truth or point to them, but it's all just kind of within the comfort and safety of these parties and social events that, by and large, are just pretty boring to read about. And to add to the monotony, this is where Ifemelu starts her blog, a blog on race and on being a Nigerian in the US and on stuff like that, which, that's cool with me that the character has a blog. It's part of her personality. But I wish we could have stayed on the level of how this affects her life instead of really printing the blog posts word for word. In these parts, I felt like I was simply reading one of these Learn About Race and Racism in the US books, which are often great books, and I've read a lot of them, but that's not why I picked up this novel, and it's not a particularly interesting way to present or allow readers to grapple with these ideas. Nor will these particular ideas seem especially intriguing or fresh if you have followed recent conversations about race. I mean, we do have to cut the author a bit of slack since it was written in 2013, and this part of the book also refers to a time period even 5 to 10 years before that. But it's not that long ago, and these conversations were certainly happening well before 2013. Occasionally it's funny, occasionally it's awkward, and occasionally it's insightful, but altogether it rarely landed for me because there was just so much of it there. The blog is also an aspect of the novel in which I think some readers who are already having a hard time separating the real-life author from her main character will start to feel annoyed, as if the author is simply preaching to them through the voice of this character. One Goodreads reviewer put it plainly, it's a message book. Now, do I think this is the case? No, I don't. I mean, I think Adichie probably sees herself in many of the other characters besides just Ifemelu. But I saw similar sentiments from written reviews, YouTube videos I watched, family members I discussed it with, of different worldviews and interests, not just people who are like critical of the content of the blog. But regardless of how one felt about the views espoused in the blog, there just seemed to be a common reaction among many that the blog was not interesting or particularly well presented within the context of the book. And even though I don't think the book is a message book, I can hardly fault people for thinking so at this particular part. I also had a hard time with this whole section. You see, when you read all these blog posts and party conversations among friends about politics, you kind of start to forget that Ifemelu is even there, because at these moments, the actual story and human element recedes into the background. And again, I get that many people do go through such a period in life when they're caught up in the abstract ideas of politics and academics and intellectual discussions and less fully engaged with like the physical world. I've been there myself many times, but it just doesn't make for interesting reading for this long section of the book. And it's not one of the dimensions where this book is the most interesting or has the most to offer anyway, so it feels like it receives much more attention in this book than it really deserves. Let me at least provide a short rebuttal, though, to the notion of it being a message book. I think many others agreed with me, and I think interviews with the author would also tend to support, that this story is not meant to show how things should or shouldn't be, but simply represents the experiences of one person. Well, multiple people, but one person in particular who it's centered on. It's not truer or less true than any other person's experiences, because they are just experiences. And although the blog does sometimes start to fall into sort of conventional American liberal talking points on race, I think even that is representative of an experience many people go through in college or at this time of life, kind of seeing different shades in the world, but also being heavily influenced by other views that may take on a larger truth in our minds without having fostered additional perspectives with which to weight and compare them, even if we stick with them ultimately. And in the end, even the ideas of the blog are somewhat challenged by Ifemelu's boyfriend, Blaine, who doesn't seem all that inspired by these ideas presented in a way to cater to popular ideological trends. Blaine himself even seems to suggest at times that these ideas are meaningless without taking action to make them become real, as he does by tutoring children without resources and spearheading certain on-campus protests. Not to say that Blaine is totally right either, but I'm just pointing out that another sympathetic character, and he is sympathetic, has yet another different perspective here. Thus, one thing that I really do like about the way the book is written is that the perspective we get here is, for me at least, not a typical and conforming perspective, not afraid to offend by offering or just exploring different perspectives. The author concedes some level of legitimacy to many perspectives, even while critiquing or poking fun at them. For example, Kurt, Ifemelu's white upper-middle-class boyfriend for much of the book, is described as having the admirable but almost kind of juvenile attitude of someone who, as a product of his life experiences to date, really and truly believes that everything is just going to work out fine in the end. And despite the mid-novel foray into the blogosphere and the somewhat intellectual environment of casual conversations in grad school, let's not forget that just 100 or so pages earlier, when Ifemelu first arrived in the US, she found herself truly puzzled in many of the conversations that took place. Like a spontaneous discussion in one of Ifemelu's college courses, in which an African student asks why the N-word was censored in the TV series Roots, leading to a charged debate in which the African student says he finds it offensive that the word was censored, and an African-American student responds by saying he would find it offensive if it were not censored. None of these perspectives presented here by these or other students, by the way, are particularly deep or insightful in the level of depth they're discussed, but they don't need to be for a group of college students that are exploring these ideas for the first or one of the first times. They felt real, and Ifemelu leaves the class with a deeper understanding of the debates and perspectives around these topics, but less of a clear sense of what her own opinion even is in such a discussion. But in the midst of exploring these and other serious topics, the book was often actually really funny, especially after Ifemelu goes to America. There are hundreds of character portraits presented in this book. The quirks and hypocrisies of all sorts of people in both Nigeria and the United States are showcased by the way the narrator, in an almost snarky way, always seems to home in on the most contradictory or puzzling aspect of a person to describe to the reader. And if you pay really close attention, you can see that we're not simply getting straight facts, a full description of this other person, because these satirical portrayals are stronger the further we get from people close to Ifemelu. I think this is part of why I noticed it most strongly when Ifemelu arrives in America. Up until this point, many of the people she's interacted with have been her close friends and family members, whom she portrays mostly in a positive light, undoubtedly ignoring some of their flaws. But in America, the descriptions of the people she meets felt for a while almost on the level of the novel Vanity Fair, another social satire about 19th century Europe that I reviewed last year. Of course, one tricky part of seeing this all through Ifemelu's lens is that at times it can be difficult to figure out what dimensions of characters and scenes are meant to be taken satirically versus to be taken at face value. Readers can determine for themselves at times, but it often means certain sections are tonally ambiguous, and I have to admit that at least some of the time it felt a little bit awkward in a way that I didn't love. Closer to our main characters, there is some humor, but more often a lot of angst, with struggles of identity and frustration with the contradictions in the world around them that occasionally lead them just to snap a bit. And as much as I liked the humor that we saw throughout the book, these deeper, more fully personal passages were my favorite part of the book. It felt like there was just much more of a balance between, on one hand, this humor and critique directed at the broader world versus, on the other hand, the more interpersonal interactions and emotional processing in the first half of the book. And then there's the end of the book, the long-awaited return to Nigeria, which I thought it had the potential to be really interesting, but it's such a short part of the book to an extent that it feels almost like an afterthought, a little anticlimactic since, in some sense, the whole book has been building to this point. What's it going to be like when the Americanah returns to her homeland, to Lagos? Of course, if we're going to be totally honest, well, I don't want to be too judgmental, but I think many readers will find that Ifemelu has not exactly become a better version of herself by the time she returns. She's not exactly a joy to be around, and at times I certainly found myself wondering whether America may have changed Ifemelu for the worse. Maybe that's why this section only ends up forming a small part of the whole story. Furthermore, at the end of the book, there is the potential for the resolution of a subplot that is kind of presented as the main plot, which has been constantly looming over us, but which hasn't yet gone anywhere since the start of the book. Ifemelu's reconnection in Nigeria with her boyfriend in high school and early in college, Obinze. Obinze is also supposedly kind of a main character in this book in his own right, but he's a clear number 2 to Ifemelu. We get a few chapters from his point of view in the middle of the book that, well, they show another different Nigerian expatriate's experience in a different country, and they serve to keep reminding us that Obinze still exists. It feels like they're supposed to lay a compelling backstory, a foundation for how Obinze came to be the person he is towards the end of the book, living the life that he's now living. But I felt rather ambivalent about these sections. I think the book would have been fine without them. I also wouldn't go as far, though, as to say they actually diminished from my experience of the book, though they did make an already long novel even longer. So I guess I'm not sure how I felt about them, other than that it felt a little off balance to me that over 3/4 of the story was told from Ifemelu's point of view with these occasional perspectives from Obinze thrown in. Before I get to that, though, and shoo away anyone who's trying to avoid spoilers, let me just mention a few other high-level topics in the novel that stood out to me. For one, this is really a story of trying to find one's identity and figuring out where home is after spending time in several different places, and the internal and external conflicts, or even just the experiences that arise from synergies and clashes between cultures. One element of this is the author's discovery of the concept of race when she came to America, since in Nigeria she never saw herself as black. I guess I can sort of imagine what that experience would be like. I mean, I had a sort of parallel experience when I first went to college, but it was, of course, for me, a much different experience in many ways, since unlike the author and her character Ifemelu, I didn't find myself suddenly the member of a group subject to discrimination and negative stereotypes. I was more learning secondhand about the existence of race from new friends and classmates who experienced it more firsthand. But I've discussed that in reviews of other books and will almost certainly discuss it again in the future, so I'm just going to leave it at that for here. Another topic explored is what America represents as an idea to the non-American or to the American immigrant. This is a topic that is also explored in Qian-Julie Wang's excellent memoir, Beautiful Country, which I talked about recently and highly recommend. Anyway, Adichie here explores the image of America versus the reality of America for immigrants and how it changes them even if they choose eventually to return to their homeland. The word Americanah itself refers to someone who's been culturally transformed by the experience of living in America. And since I maintain that this isn't a message book, we see ways in which our characters have changed for the better, ways in which they've changed for the worse, and ways in which they've just changed. It's not always clear that the changes have to be good or bad changes, but there's no doubt that America has changed these characters. The book is similarly neither a scathing criticism nor an effusive praise of the countries it features. Americanah portrays a Nigeria and a United States, and sometimes a UK, I guess, that have their quirks and are sometimes rough around the edges, but that shouldn't be totally written off either. The Washington Post review, for example, called it a work with a ruthless honesty about the ugly and beautiful sides of both nations. So how about the ending now? And yes, this would be the time to exit if you're really concerned about spoilers. If you're not sure though, I'd personally recommend in this case it's okay to stay because it's not really some huge revelation. So how about the ending? Or more precisely, really, how about the initial and final romance plot between which everything else that's happened in the book has been sandwiched? Personally, I felt the romance between Ifemelu and Obinze to have been overemphasized throughout the book in an attempt to create some greater sense of importance or emotional investment in the reader than I think was truly warranted. Sure, the majority of this book is ostensibly being related to us as Ifemelu is caught up in daydreaming about a past love as she sits in the salon having her hair braided. So it's probably fair to assume that Obinze's role in the story, as told to us by the present Ifemelu narrating it, is larger and more important in many moments than it really was to her at the time. But if that's the case, then there's really not so much justification for these parts in which we exit Ifemelu's mind entirely and jump to Obinze's experience in England, which Ifemelu would have no way of knowing about, and which from a more critical perspective seem inserted almost just to remind the reader that Obinze is still important, even though we've now spent hundreds of pages reading about Ifemelu's other relationships. In one of the most critical takes I saw on this aspect of the novel, Janet Moslin of the New York Times writes, Ms. Adichie disappointingly allows her story to slip to the level of a simple romance, leaving her readers to wonder, not very much, whether Ifemelu and Obinze will be reunited. It's a provocative claim that packages together quite a few critiques at once, and I guess I'll leave it as an exercise to you to ponder what you think of that, because I'm still not quite sure myself, but there certainly is something to it. In any case, I suspect that most readers will be less enraptured by the final reunion of Ifemelu and a now married Obinze than Ifemelu herself is. I kind of guessed that the two would get back together at the end of the novel, but then I also predicted that for whatever reason they would separate again by the last few pages. Maybe discovering that they no longer had as much in common as they used to, or maybe that their ideas of each other over all these years had been more compelling than the less glamorous realities of one another. Maybe finding that Ifemelu had been changed enough by America that Obinze simply couldn't love the person that she'd become. Or maybe just deciding Obinze's marriage was worth respecting, whether his wife was the ideal partner for him or not. Any of these could have been a typical novelistic ending, I guess you could say, but it's not what happens here. Instead, we get a true reunion that feels not all that satisfying, neither novelistically nor romantically, because these characters have made, in my mind, poor decisions here, and I don't find myself particularly satisfied by their reunion, or even sanguine about the future of their recently rekindled relationship. But we have to let the characters do their thing, whether it's what we'd choose ourselves or not, so maybe that in itself is novelistically satisfying. And apparently, actually, readers' feelings are quite mixed on whether the two of them really made the right decision here. Some say that the past needs to be left in the past instead of trying to restore this imagined past that was there so many years ago by disrupting the present. This is pretty much my take, too. Others, though, say it's not worth it to spend one's life constrained by a commitment that one no longer actually values, which in this case is Obinze's marriage. And I get that perspective, but I think we just have to remember that it's not fair to weigh an observably unhappy present against an imagined blissful and satisfying future. And we have to also consider that there are less disruptive ways in which the unhappy present could be transformed into something more peaceful and hopeful. And there are plenty of ways in which the imagined euphoric future could actually turn out to be a complete disaster once Ifemelu and Obinze finally realize that there's more to one another than this rose-colored image they seem to have been cultivating through their 15 years of separation. But it's what they chose, and that's how the book ends. So it's up to you to imagine how things will develop from here. If I'm going to let Mike the Cynic take over for a minute here, though, this is all just indicative of the biggest Americanization that happened to Ifemelu during the novel. And you know, I say this as an American myself, who's guilty of it myself as well, hopefully to a lesser extent. It's individualism taken to excess. A sad inclination to center our own wants and place them above the wants and needs of others, while not even being self-aware enough to understand what our own needs are in the first place. It's happened to Ifemelu, but I guess she also kind of knows it at least. It's clear from the way she talks about her Americanization at the end of the novel. She's not exactly proud of these newest changes, but she embraces them all the same. But maybe your view on the final chapters of this novel is a bit less of a cynical interpretation than mine. And that's Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I knew I had some stuff to say about this book, but wow, I didn't realize I'd go on for this long. I guess even though the book ended up just okay for me, or a little bit better than okay in the end, the parts I appreciated about it were special enough to warrant extended discussion. So I hope you enjoyed it, the book or the review, or both, and happy reading.